And welcome to the Oddity Archive, the show that has its finger on the pulse code modulation thingy. Despite the looks of it, this episode has been kind of brewing with me for several years now. And it's taken me so long to put even a low-level system together that a handful of other YouTubers have beaten me to the punch on this one. So anyway, let me give a little personal background for this one. So, if you've watched Archive long enough, you know that I have at least a little background in music and audio, and I went to school at least partially for audio. And so the school was a little bit behind the times in the audio department. So, despite this being the mid 2000s, as far as they were concerned, this was still kind of the tail end of the DAT, digital audio tape, and ADAT, Alesis digital audio tape era. And more tellingly, when talking about mastering audio, making truly that final product, it would be mastering to Betamax or 3/4 inch U-Matic videotape. To make CDs and stuff off of. But the school didn't have any of that end of the video stuff anymore by then, but already being a little bit of a retro tech nerd, it piqued my interest. But of course I never got to play with any of that stuff till now, and even then only more on a consumer-prosumer kind of level. So anyway, let's take the opportunity here to take a look at PCM, pulse code modulation, modulated audio, at least up through the mid-80s. This is one of those things with such a long, storied history, and one that is still being written as of my making this, that, I'm just going to kind of give a short history lesson. This is going to be more about playing with the gear. So, in case you haven't quite gathered what I'm talking about here, PCM was kind of the original notion and the original stab at collecting and reproducing analog data through digital means. It gets more interesting as it goes along. I think, anyway. This is one of those things that probably needs a proper book written on it. I'll leave that to the professionals. For the purposes of this video, here's the shortest possible history lesson with the cutoff date at 1983. The notion of sampling and reproducing data as audio dates as far back as the early telegraph era. We're talking the mid-19th century. By the end of World War II, the Allies were using a form of PCM as part of a system called Sig-Sally to transmit and, more importantly, encrypt the most important of communications, mostly between FDR and Winston Churchill. In the late 60s, Japanese broadcaster NHK developed the first PCM digital audio units. First in 1967 in mono at a 12-bit 30 kHz rate, then in stereo in 1969 at a 13-bit 32 kHz rate. Both systems recorded to, I believe, 2-inch quadruplex videotape, but don't quote me on that. As for the use of video recorders and videotape, as opposed to audio tape, the idea was that a video recorder could handle much greater amounts of bandwidth and, by turn, data. Over the span of the 70s, Denon in Japan and 3M in the US independently rolled out a line of digital audio recorders, all recording at different bit rates. By 1978, 3M had installed a 32-track digital machine at Amigos Studios in North Hollywood. This machine used 1-inch audio tape and ran at 45 inches per second. By the end of the year, a few classical recordings had been made and released using it, but the first noteworthy record was Ry Cooder's Bop Till You Drop, released in July of '79, whose CD reissue is one of the flattest, wimpiest things I've ever heard. The sound, that is. The music is fine. In 1977, Sony introduced the first of its PCM audio mastering units, the PCM-1600, which was ultimately intended to be used with the Sony BVU-200B U-Matic video deck, which wasn't introduced until '79. This unit ran audio through XLR microphone plugs and/or BNC composite video. At about the same time, for smaller operations, Sony introduced the PCM-1, which was sold in tandem with an SLO 320 industrial Betamax deck. The complete rig ran for about $4,400, or about $2,000 for just the PCM-1. This time around, the PCM-1 ran digital audio and a loose video representation thereof via an RCA-styled composite jack. This was superseded by the PCM-F1 in 1981, which served the dual purpose of being a PCM transfer master unit as well as being a field recorder for use in tandem with the Sony SL2000 portable Betamax deck. The same year, Technics released an all-in-one 14-bit VHS-driven PCM unit. Techmoan's got a good video on that one. The Sony PCM-1610, introduced in 1980, was the first professional unit that could record at the Redbook standard of 16-bit 44.1 kHz, the same bitrate as the not-yet-released compact disc. Incidentally, this and its successor, the 1630, were used to master major label CDs well into the 90s. If you own any major label CDs from 1982 to 94 or so, it probably came indirectly from one of these machines. Conversely, the first consumer unit to function at Redbook CD spec was the PCM-701ES, introduced in the spring of 1983. And that brings us to my gear. Bear with me here on two counts. One, I've got quite a bit to say, and two, it is storming like crazy out there. So if it sounds like sand is getting thrown against the window, it's actually ice, but you'll know what the noise is. So anyway, in 1983, Sony introduced Beta Hi-Fi and redesigned most of their VCRs to a standard, usually black, front-loading device, like this thing. So to tie in with this, they redesigned their consumer-prosumer PCM unit. Now, if I've got the chronology right, this, the 701ES, is not only the first PCM unit in this design, but it's also the first consumer-prosumer PCM unit to adhere to the Redbook audio standard, which again is used on CDs. So after this, Sony took the 701 and stripped it down internally and called it the 501ES. I did get my hands on the much more common PCM-501ES, in box no less, but there was a bit of an issue. So despite coming from Ohio, I managed to acquire a PAL C-Cam unit. As in European. As in 220 volts. I don't own a PAL beta deck. I don't have a dedicated PAL VHS deck, nor do I own any step-up converters. And yes, before you ask, the Fleabay seller failed to include this rather important bit of info in their listing. And either the pictures weren't good enough or I wasn't paying attention or whatever, but it just slid right past me. But the cost to ship this thing back was going to cancel out the refund I would have gotten, so I've just held on to it, and it's been well over a year now. So I guess, Techmoan, if you happen to see this and you're interested, though I kind of doubt it because this doesn't seem esoteric enough for you, maybe I can get this one over to your side of the pond, though you'll need a Euro to UK plug adapter thingy for it. And now back to the geek rant already in progress. The 501 was followed by the one that's sought after by collectors and archivists, and that would be the 601ES, which was introduced in late 85, early 86. But the 601 is sought after because it's the only one of these kind of more prosumery units to feature S/PDIF, or SPDIF as I like to call it, and a lot of audio engineers do call it that, SPDIF in and outputs. And that way you can keep the audio completely digital because you're only outputting analog for this thing. Now, these days, 601s are being used mostly to copy over those earlier pre-Red Book tapes to the, as implied, Red Book CD standard. Now, for the longest time, I was after one of those 601s, but it just never happened. And I gave up for two reasons. One, when they would turn up on Fleabay, which isn't too often, they sell for at least $500. And then number two, I would also have to invest in a good qualified modern day digital, of course, PCM recorder, and those start around $1,000. And that way I can, not only keep the digital stream completely intact, but it would cut down on any post-production I would have to do, because there are some minor latency issues and stuff that generally aren't audible to the untrained ear, but, if you're going through the trouble of doing this in the first place, you might as well do it right. But anyway, the bottom line is I have no practical reason to shoot for a 601. So what I did was I set my sights one notch lower and held out for this 701. Now, this is still a perfectly good archivism in that this gives us a good, if somewhat lower level, insight into how the music world was handling things with the rise of CDs and how it ultimately lapsed into downloads and streaming. And not only that, I'm going to go slightly off track here. Sony had its sights set reasonably high with these kind of prosumery units. So, Mobile Fidelity, the big audio nerd label, the big audiophile label, had a brief run of PCM releases on Betamax and VHS. This was only in 1983, so I guess it would have only truly worked with the 701 here at the time. But as far as I know, none of the, I think, 6 titles that they put out made it past the initial run of 100 copies apiece. And when those things do come up on Fleabay, they usually sell for somewhere in the high 3 to low 4 figure range. Not because they sound any better than a Mobile Fidelity CD. I mean, in terms of specs, they're exactly the same, but it's just for the rarity. But anyway, let's get back on track here. Now, you do not have to use Betamax with this. Theoretically, anything with composite video should be able to record and play back PCM audio as long as you've got a decoder. And you also don't need to have a hi-fi VCR, like this one, because the audio is going completely through the video jacks. So the VCR's regular audio frequency response doesn't factor in. Now, you can use a hi-fi unit, and you can leave it on, and it's not going to make any difference, but yeah, it's not an issue. Now, having said that, for the main testing here, because if you've watched this show long enough, when I can, I like to be as period accurate as possible. So I'm going to be using, for the bulk of this, my Sony SL-HF 650 Super Beta Hi-Fi unit. I believe this is from 1986. Now, the manual suggests that you only use, with regards to Betamax, L500 or shorter tapes. So it just so happened that I had a still sealed, very late period Sony L500 tape kicking around. And to make things even better, the heads on my beta deck were clean. I hadn't touched that VCR since I did the VCR cleaning video a few months ago. Now, with regards to the PCM unit, this may very well be age-related. I didn't see anything in the manual about it. I didn't go through it with a fine-tooth comb either, though, admittedly. But I found that I have to let this thing warm up for 5 to 10 minutes before using it, especially if I'm running line out to anything. I found that if I don't let it warm up, the video signal drops dramatically, and by turn the audio, and I wind up with all these problems. So I'll cut in a picture here, but there's a headphone jack on the front you can use to monitor if that's all you're doing. But it's not a traditional volume knob for it. Instead, it's truly an attenuation knob with 5 predetermined stops on it. Now, as for audio material, I was already aware that there's a pretty heavy pre-emphasis affecting the high frequencies in recording with these things. And so what happens is it will skew an already bright, treble-heavy recording, and it will make the PCM recording levels very hard to control, though it all gets rolled off again in playback. So as such, I felt like I had the perfect piece of music for it. So I did my first test, and as it turned out, just a good bass line in general, using a piece of pseudo Muzak I did a couple years ago called FDG. And on that one, I was really shooting for a late 80s kind of thing, right down to the ear-splittingly bright EQ job. So, as for controlling the audio levels, my fears were definitely not unfounded. I found that even the slightest change, like a 16th of a notch between whole numbers on the dial, meant the difference between a PCM recording that would either slightly, ultra briefly clip, or one that might only peak between -6 and -10 dB on the same piece of music. Now, unsurprisingly, audio with less extreme EQ is much easier to handle. And I actually find that kind of amusing because if you know your audio engineer history well enough, you'll know that most non-classical recordings from, call it the early mid-80s through early 90s, were getting EQ'd to death, especially on the high end. And so I can only imagine the mastering engineers just beating their heads against the wall working with material that was likely intentionally over EQ'd on the high end because, it was still audio cassettes being the dominant format, and a lot of those pre-recorded cassettes were type 1s, not so great high end on those, so they were kind of trying to compensate for it. But anyway, truly getting down to business here, I've done all the practical potential tests. So, of course, I've done Betamax. I've done standard VHS. But having said that, remember, everything is going through composite video. So I can't do SVHS or DVHS. I've also done U-Matic, and I've done the one and only digital format that won't eat the audio too bad, and that's DVD-R. Now, I do own a Cloner Alliance box that will take composite, but even at the highest setting, that thing noticeably data compresses the audio, so I'm just leaving that one out of the mix. Yeah, this is gonna pretty much take up the rest of today's episode. Well, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I get arrested for trying to sell my sweet, sweet mixtapes.